Welcome everyone. This is a special presentation of the French and Indian War hosted by Forever Scholars and Professor Richard Bell. My name is Anthony Hannon. I'm here at Forever Scholars and I'm going to be the moderator for today. And before we begin, I just want to make a few things clear. So as we're going through the lecture, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box and not the chat, just because it makes it easier to go through when we're in the Q&A portion of the presentation. And today it is a 45-minute lecture with a 15-minute discussion at the end. So just remember to put those questions in and we'll get to them right at the end. And Professor Bell is also hosting two courses with Forever Scholars. The first starts next week, and it is On the Road to the American Revolution, which is a 4-part series. And each session in the series features a 60-minute lecture with a 30-minute class discussion. It's a really great way to learn more about the topic and ask any burning questions that you might have related to the material. So if you'd like to learn more about that class, you can visit us at foreverscholars.com, or I'm going to just drop the link to it in the chat right now to both courses. So I just dropped the link in the chat, and then I will talk about the second course with Professor Bell, which is Critical Race Theory in the 1619 Project. That is actually a 2-part series. That starts on Monday, February 20th at 6:30 p.m. Eastern. And this seminar will take you beyond the headlines to discover what critical race theory really is and an exploration into the 1619 Project. So you'll have 2 live lectures and 2 live discussions. And if you want to learn more about that course or any of our courses, again, visit foreverscholars.com. And I did drop the link in the chat for that, but I'm going to do it again, just in case you want to click through. All right, now, without further delay, I'd like to introduce Professor Richard Bell. Richard Bell is a professor of history at the University of Maryland and author of the book Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home, which was shortlisted for the George Washington Prize and the Harriet Tubman Prize. He's held major research fellowships at Yale, Cambridge, and the Library of Congress, and is the recipient of the National Endowment of the Humanities Public Scholar Award and the Andrew Carnegie Fellowship. He serves as a trustee of the Maryland Center for History and Culture and as a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Welcome, Professor Bell. We're very happy to have you, and I will turn the Zoom room over to you.
Thanks. It's great to be back with Forever Scholars. Hello to all of you out there in Zoomland. We have an enormous crowd today. I'm really pleased that so many folks came out for this free talk. And if you like this talk, and I hope you do, I think you'll really like both of the courses that we're offering through Forever Scholars in the next few weeks. So do take a look at those. All right, let's get started, folks. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I think, let's count to 3. I think that as of right now, you can see my slides and you can hear my voice and you can see my face, which is probably the signal. Yeah, I see a thumbs up, which is very reassuring. Probably the signal that I should get started because there's lots to talk about. And it's one of the paradoxes of American history that in the decades right before the Revolution, most American colonists actually felt more British than at any other time in the history of colonial America. As we'll see today, a lot of those strong feelings of Britishness in the colonies had to do with the great global war between the British and French empires that took place in the middle of the 1700s. That global war was so massive that British and French armies clashed not only in Ohio and Pennsylvania, but also in Canada, in the Caribbean, in Belgium and Germany, in the Philippines, and even in India. Now, in Europe and the rest of the world, this global war between Britain and France is known as the 7 Years' War, but here in America, we generally call it the French and Indian War, or at least that's the American part of it. And today we'll keep our eyes mostly fixed on the parts of this global war that did take place here on North American soil. So over the next 45 minutes or so, we will track the shifting fortunes of the British and French forces, as well as their native and colonial American allies. Then we'll eventually look at the peace treaty that Britain and France finally signed in 1763 to bring this war to an end. a treaty that would surrender French Canada to the British and would force the French out of North America. And then finally, we'll take a good look at how American involvement in this global war between Britain and France reinforced colonists' sense of themselves as essential partners in the British Empire. So we've got a lot to do in a short amount of time. As many of you know, Britain, France, and Spain have fought each other for centuries. Yet before 1735, America had never been more than a sideshow in that endless cycle of belligerence. Before 1735, those wars were fought mostly in Europe, and only tiny fractions of European armies were ever deployed to fight each other on American soil or in American waters. All this began to change around the mid-1730s as Britain became increasingly jealous of the vast profits being generated on French and Spanish sugar plantations in the Caribbean. By comparison, the profits from British sugar islands like Jamaica and rice colonies like South Carolina looked quite silly and insignificant. So to try to put a dent in their rivals' fortunes, British ships in 1739 began attacking Spanish shipping in the Caribbean, effectively declaring war. Thinking that the Spanish Empire was militarily weak, that it was decadent, that it was bloated, the British had predicted little resistance from the Spanish as they fleeced their ships and ports and possessions. But it quickly became clear that Britain had underestimated the Spanish. The Spanish were more resourceful and better able to defend themselves than the British had expected. British privateers succeeded in many pirating raids, but that was about it. The two major British military assaults on Spanish fortifications both failed. One was at St. Augustine in Florida in 1740. The other was against the Caribbean seaport of Cartagena in 1741. The British attacked those Spanish fortifications and lost. In fact, thousands of British men were killed, wounded, or captured in these failed offensives. The only significant British victory in this war with the Spanish was a defensive British victory, when the British repelled a Spanish assault on the new decade-old colony of Georgia in 1741. And then 3 years later, in 1744, the French joined this conflict. By this time, the war between Britain and Spain had become known as the War of Jenkins' Ear, after London newspapers learned that a British smuggler named Robert Jenkins had lost his ear to the Spanish as they punished him for his piracy. What had at first been a conflict between Britain and Spain that had taken place entirely in the Caribbean now expanded to include a major conflict on European soil, as all three massive armies, Britain, Spain, and France, clashed in present-day Belgium and Germany. In fact, Britain now largely abandoned the American part of this escalating conflict, and Britain instead concentrated all of its military resources on those European battles, which left only a volunteer force made up of American colonists to fight on against the parts of the French and Spanish armies still very much stationed in the New World. The British government hoped that this American colonial militia would simply be able to hold the line and just not please lose any territory in North America to France or to Spain. Yet Britain's American colonists went one better than that. Britain's American colonists launched an offensive to try to capture the great fortress of Louisbourg up in New France in 1745. If you draw your eyes all the way to the right, just below Newfoundland, you'll see Louisbourg. So you can see here, Louisbourg was a fortified seaport. It was built on Cape Breton Island in the Gulf of the St. Lawrence River. It was designed to defend French supply lines along the St. Lawrence River as far as Quebec and to protect the lucrative French fisheries in the Gulf. This fort, the Louisbourg fort, the French fort, was a massive, massive structure. It had been built in 1718 by the French at an astronomical cost, surrounded by enormous stone walls, bristling with cannon, and garrisoned by about 1,500 regular French troops. Louisbourg was the most formidable fortress on the North American mainland. Inside it, about 4,200 French colonists made this settlement, this garrison, the largest town in all of New France, even bigger than Quebec City. And remember its location. Its location was so strategic that any British or colonial attack on New France, on French Canada, would have to begin with Louisbourg. In 1744, within months of France allying with Spain against Britain, the commander of the Louisbourg fortress had begun attacking fishing stations belonging to British colonies, and had authorized French privateers to raid New England ships and New England shipping. And that didn't go down well with the American colonists. William Shirley, the governor of the Massachusetts colony, responded quickly, seeking to gain popularity in New England and to gain respect from the British government by organizing an expedition to seize Louisbourg for the British Empire. Governor Shirley of Massachusetts sent 4,000 volunteer American soldiers from New England to lay siege to that giant, formidable fortress, assisted by just one naval squadron from Britain itself. This would seem like a suicide mission, and yet remarkably, this American siege of this French fortress was successful. This formidable fortress fell to the New England volunteers in 1745. The colonists and their volunteer force of militiamen felt tremendous pride that they'd contributed to Britain's global war effort this way by capturing this extremely well-defended and highly strategic French fortress. What a win for the colonists. Meanwhile, the global war, sputtered on. A peace treaty signed in 1748 allowed the Spanish to withdraw from this fight, and annoyingly also returned the Louisbourg fort right back to the French. But that peace of 1748 did not last long. Both Britain and France were frustrated by the lack of any lasting gains in all the recent fighting, and so, believe it or not, they were soon spoiling for more for round two. Both sides, Britain and France, tried to find just cause for full-on war against one another by staging a number of local skirmishes. They're eager to restart this war. Most notably, agents of the French and the British began testing each other and their patience out on the frontiers of Western Pennsylvania, a region where land speculators and traders from the British colonies were crossing from the Ohio River to seize more territory and greater control of the profitable native fur trade. The French saw these moves correctly as encroachments on their markets. And the French were keen to protect the alliances they'd made with natives in that region, alliances they'd spent decades fostering. the French in the backcountry also wanted to preserve and protect their communications and supply lines between French Canada and Louisiana. So when British American settlers start pushing onto land where French fur traders have been active, those French fur traders sound the alarm. They sent for help from the French government. And soon, in 1754, military reinforcements arrive there from Paris. This is an escalation. The French army arrives and sets about building a set of defensive forts to protect their fur traders at the fork of the Ohio River. And the largest of these new French forts sits on the site of what is today Pittsburgh. Though at the time it wasn't called Pittsburgh, it was called Fort Duquesne. If you've ever been to Pittsburgh and wondered why there's a Duquesne University there with a good basketball team, it's because Pittsburgh was originally a French settlement called Fort Duquesne, built as a fortification against encroaching American colonists. But the American colonists are not happy either. They refuse to let the French build all these fortifications so close to their own backyards. So in 1754, the Virginia colony sends a small regiment of troops to try to evict the French from these new forts they've been building at the fork of the Ohio River. And these Virginia provincial troops will be led by a young, ambitious, 22-year-old Virginian land speculator by the name of, what was his name? Let me check my notes. Oh, George Washington was his name. Maybe you've heard of him. And this would be Washington's first military command. And, like any untested soldier, he displayed that lack of prior combat experience at every opportunity. Instead of launching a surprise hit-and-run attack on Fort Duquesne, Washington actually accidentally gave away his position, and he was soon surrounded by a large French force and their native allies, while he and his colonial troops were still at camp. And that camp, which Washington called Fort Necessity, I think my slides need to catch up. Here we go. That camp, which Washington called Fort Necessity, was not in a great situation. It was hard to defend. It was in the middle of a swamp. It was surrounded by higher ground, which means that he and his troops were sitting ducks. And the French and their native allies fired on them from the hills on all sides, forcing the American colonists, the Virginians, to surrender on July the 4th, 1754. You can't make this stuff up. Showing mercy, the French commander let Washington and his remaining men limp back to Virginia with their tails between their legs. Washington's humiliating surrender and the news that Fort Duquesne was still in French hands intensified British anger at French aggression out in the backcountry. So in early 1755, the government over in London decided to make war in North America its highest priority. Showing some foresight, British authorities had already directed the governor of New York to convene a colonial conference to plan a unified defense strategy of the American colonies and to make preparations to rebuff any French attack on the British colonies. Delegates from 7 of these British American colonies met in Albany in June and July of 1754. At that Albany Congress, Ben Franklin, who was representing Pennsylvania, proposed a colonial plan of union, a proposal for a central colonial government with powers to wage war and make a common defense policy. Still part of the British Empire, but working all the colonies together for one purpose. The delegates in Albany all grudgingly but informally agreed to this plan for intercolonial defense, which is significant. This was one of the first times that these British colonies had ever tried to act as one single body. But to Franklin's surprise, when the delegates returned to their home colonies, not a single one of those colonies agreed to formally approve the Albany Plan for intercolonial defense. Those individual colonial legislatures believed that this collective defensive agreement might force them to surrender powers to a central colonial government, powers they would not be able to get back. While the American colonies were failing to agree on how to defend themselves when the French attacked, the British government was moving ahead. Early in 1755, the British government dispatched the largest military force to the American colonies that it had ever sent. That army was charged with seizing control of the backcountry frontier from the French. This British military campaign scored an early victory up in Nova Scotia, but otherwise, this British military campaign did not begin well. It was led by a veteran British general, a man named Edward Braddock, a man not used to fighting in the American forests. And so perhaps not surprisingly, the British forces ran into trouble there after underestimating what assistance the natives could provide to the French army. General Braddock famously told Ben Franklin that these savages may indeed be a formidable enemy to your raw American militia. But upon the king's regular and disciplined troops, sir, it is impossible to believe those natives should make any impression. He's saying he's not scared of those natives. Just how wrong Braddock was soon became apparent when Braddock marched his men straight into a French and native ambush 10 miles short of Fort Duquesne. With only half as many men as the British force, the French and the natives were able to leverage their familiarity with the forest. The French and the natives fired at the British from behind trees and rocks and into the massed and completely exposed British and colonial ranks. The French and the natives lost only 40 lives, while the British forces under Braddock suffered 1,000 deaths or serious casualties. General Braddock himself was killed in that ambush, and young George Washington had to take command of the army. And of course, his first action had to be to call a retreat. One of the reasons that Braddock blundered so readily into this ambush was the lack of native allies on the British side. Only 8 native people were with the British force as they advanced towards Fort Duquesne, and Braddock had ignored their advice at every turn. One of those native men later recalled that Braddock looked upon us as dogs who would never hear anything we said to him. Sensing British weakness, other native groups, emboldened by Braddock's defeat, now attacked British colonies. In 1755 and 1756, the Lenni Lenape and Shawnee groups of the Ohio Valley launched offensives against hated colonial settlements in Virginia, in Maryland, and in Pennsylvania. And in the course of those raids on American colonies, killed or captured at least 700 settlers. The remaining colonists in these western settlements fled east for safety, abandoning their farms. Meanwhile, the French army took the offensive also. Under the leadership of this guy on the screen, General Montcalm, the French army and its native allies and Canadian militiamen together captured British forts on Lake Ontario and on Lake George. But because the French commander, General Montcalm, lacked the numbers of soldiers necessary to actually occupy and hold on to those captured forts, he usually destroyed them after capturing them, and he later withdrew back to Canada, sort of hit and run missions from the French commander there. But still, successes as far as the French are concerned. In London, news of more embarrassing defeats now forces a change in senior leadership. In 1757, King George II appoints a new prime minister, a man named William Pitt, to take over and lead this failing global war effort against the French. Pitt was a talented, but also very arrogant administrator, and he quickly promised impressive results. In 1757, Pitt boasted that, "I believe I can save this nation and no one else can, I alone." Even though the war had now spilled into Europe, Prime Minister Pitt's plan is to keep the focus of British military efforts on America. And by 1758, Pitt has doubled the amount of British military resources in America, almost bankrupting Britain to do so. So this is a good old-fashioned troop surge. We've seen them time and again. And when that troop surge to America is at full strength in 1758, the combined colonial American and British forces do outnumber French and native forces roughly 5-1. Pitt also appoints a new slate of more experienced generals. Pitt puts colonial soldiers like Washington into leadership positions. And Pitt encourages his armies to experiment with native-style warfare tactics wherever possible. His commanders now even train some British soldiers to use colonial rifles and Native American tomahawks instead of just European weapons like the bayonet and the musket. At the same time as British soldiers are pouring into the Ohio backcountry, Britain's Royal Navy is also setting to work, strangling the French Navy's supply chain to North America. And this matters a great deal, I think, because by winning control of the ocean in 1758, Pitt's Royal Navy prevents the French from resupplying their army in America, and so also prevents French commanders on the ground from using imported goods from France to continue to reward native allies for their military support. And so this matters. In fact, as a direct consequence of the British naval blockade against the French in 1758, natives begin to abandon the French coalition. And they begin to trade with better supplied British American traders. The French find themselves increasingly deserted by their native allies, and that leaves them vulnerable and exposed. And the French now blow up their own forts on the Ohio frontier and flee back to the safety of French Canada. The French are on the back foot for the first time in this war. Seizing that advantage, the British now chase the French back into French Canada, and the British attack Quebec City in 1759. The British general, James Wolfe, you can see him on the left, leads his army into a winner-take-all battle with the French army, which is still led by General Montcalm. The battle takes place on a piece of high ground just outside the walls of Quebec City. After a firefight there that lasts only half an hour, the French retreat. Believe me when I tell you, this is the most important British victory in this American war. And it comes at a hell of a cost. Both Montcalm and Wolfe are killed in this short but deadly battle, leaving their deputies to negotiate the terms of the French surrender of the Quebec territory on September the 18th, 1759. General Wolfe, the British commander who dies in battle, becomes a national hero in Britain, a symbol of British sacrifice for the empire, for the cause. This is a very famous history painting you're looking at. It's actually by an American artist, and it's painted 11 years later in 1770. It depicts the moment when General Wolfe is shot and killed. It's a remarkable image. It's one of the great history paintings of the 18th century. General Wolfe, of course, is the guy in the red suit at the bottom. You'll notice, of course, that the red suit he's wearing makes you think of the blood that is rapidly leaving his body. He's being attended by a guy in blue who, of course, is a doctor, just like on Star Trek. You can see that there is a rolled up British flag unfurling above him. You can see that people are praying for him, but you can also see that the battle is being waged and won by the British in the background. Look at the sky, look at the clouds, look at the direction of the wind. They're all the artists telling you that Britain is winning this war, even at the cost of James Wolfe's life. The guy on the left in the green is actually not a British officer. He's a colonial American officer. Look at his pants. And he's seen a messenger on the far left bringing news that, sir, we've won, we've won, we've won. And so the American, the guy in green, is delivering that message to the dying General Wolfe. Sir, it was worth it. We won. You did it, sir. You'll notice the Native American in the foreground as well. There weren't actually many Native Americans at this particular battle, but his presence is a symbol that by this point in the war, Britain had started to acquire many Native allies, having peeled some of them away from the French. You may also recognize the pose of James Wolfe slumped down there. It may remind some of you of the Pieta, Jesus Christ being taken down from the cross. So the artist is drawing parallels between Christ's sacrifice on behalf of all mankind and General Wolfe's sacrifice on behalf of the British Empire. It's a remarkable painting, as I said. So this is a great victory for the British. It leads to the immediate loss of Quebec City by the French. And over the next 12 months, there will be much more good news for the British cause in North America. Over the next 12 months, the British will mop up all remaining French forces in Canada, and the British will capture Montreal, which is where the French generals will formally surrender in 1760. So what we're seeing here is the loss of French Canada. Canada is now, after 1760, and for the first time, in British control. Canada has fallen. The British were able to produce a victory in this multi-year conflict because they were able to spend more money to fund their campaigns than the French. Britain was also the more advanced capitalist economy at the time, and the British economy could support greater war spending than any other nation in Europe. In fact, the conquest of Canada cost the British Empire about £4 million, which is more than 10 times what the French had spent trying to defend their territory. My point here is that never before had any European empire spent so much money to wage war on a scale like this. Britain is winning the war in North America, but at a hell of an economic cost. Now, the conquest of Canada brought the conflict in the American theater of this global war largely to an end in 1760. But it's a global war, and the British are still fighting the French elsewhere around the world. In the Caribbean, the British are trying to capture the French sugar island of Guadeloupe and to suppress a massive slave revolt in British Jamaica. In West Africa, the British are seizing Senegal, and in India, the British are trying to rout the French and their local allies. Over the next 3 years after 1760, the British will have a string of military victories in all the places around the world I just named. And so by 1763, the French are finally ready to make a global peace treaty with the British. In that treaty, the Treaty of Paris, the French will formally and finally surrender Canada and all of their claims to land east of the Mississippi. And in a related transaction, the Spanish will cede Florida to the British, who in return will cede Havana in Cuba to the Spanish. All these various exchanges make the Mississippi River the new official boundary between the British in the eastern half of North America and the Spanish in the central half of North America, and will serve to banish the French from the North American mainland entirely. So this is what it looks like on a map, right? France is gone from the mainland. Two European powers are splitting up what's left. Now, of course, this is just the map. This territorial agreement that you see in front of you doesn't actually reflect the occupation on the ground. On the ground, most of the lands now changing hands in Paris continue to be occupied actually by native peoples, who of course deny Europeans authority to dispose of those lands in this way. So some of these borders are notional, right? And actually, it's Indian country, it's Native America. But still, this is the new European map. The collapse of the French Empire in America was dreadful news to Native Americans. With France now banished from North America, natives could no longer play the French and the British off against each other to try to maintain their own security. Now British troops occupied French forts throughout the backcountry. And British commanders there refused to continue the French practice of gift giving, a practice that had made relations between the French and the natives so friendly for so long. At the same time, colonial American governors were doing nothing to stop the tide of American settlers pouring into the Ohio Valley and the Carolina backcountry after peace returned to that area in 1760. Feeling insulted, feeling aggrieved by these intrusions and these squatters, and by the lack of further gift giving, various native chiefs in the interior begin to cultivate a new cooperation between their peoples and search for a common pan-Indian solution to American encroachments and to their new troubles. During the spring of 1763, natives in the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes prepare for war against British traders and soldiers and American settlers. And this was a broad native alliance. It included at least 13 different major native tribal groups. Some scholars have noted that their alliance was not simply strategic, but was also evidence of a growing pan-native identity being fostered across Native America by a new breed of native religious leaders or prophets. The most famous prophet of pan-native identity in this period was a Lenni Lenape man named Neolin. By adapting some Christian ideas to native belief systems, Neolin preached a gospel of a double creation. One creation for all natives, another creation for all Europeans, but completely separate. Neolin was preaching that the Creator had intended natives to be forever separate and autonomous from Europeans, and thus that all native nations should fight together for a common interest against Europeans. Neolin, this religious leader, was especially insistent that on no account should natives cede any more land to Europeans, nor should they drink any European alcohol offered to them, in case drunkenness caused them to sign away their remaining territory. That spring, the spring of 1763, this loose alliance of native groups, which the British believed to be led by a guy named Pontiac, this loose alliance of native groups would surprise their colonial neighbors by attacking and by capturing a number of strategic British forts in the backcountry. Then in summer and fall, those natives raided colonial settlements in the western reaches of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, killing or capturing about 2,000 American colonists. That's a lot of people. The natives' overly optimistic hope was that by crippling these colonies, they could lure the French back to the continent to join with them to finish the job and annihilate the British American settlers. Those British and American colonists got scared and angry real fast. And they reacted quickly to these raids, to these incursions. They mistakenly believed that now all Native Americans were set against them. And so these colonists, these scared and angry colonists, now turned on any natives they could find to exact their revenge for all these recent raids. And the peaceful Conestoga natives of Pennsylvania now found themselves cast as enemies of the colonists. In December of 1763, a group of 50 armed colonists from the town of Paxton, Pennsylvania, attacked a friendly settlement of Conestoga natives living nearby. They butchered the sleeping Conestoga men, women, and children, and set their cabins on fire. Only later that day, as these Paxton boys rummaged through the ashes of the Conestoga's encampment, did they come across the charred remains of not one, but 6 treaties of friendship between the Conestoga and the colony of Pennsylvania. The oldest of these was a treaty from 1701 signed by William Penn himself that had promised these Conestogas that they and the colonists of Pennsylvania shall forever be as one head and one heart and live in true friendship and amity as one people. And yet still these rampaging Paxton boys were not yet finished. Next, they attacked the jail in Lancaster, where the governor of Pennsylvania had stashed 14 surviving Conestoga for their own safety. The Paxton boys broke in and killed and mutilated all 14 natives. Early the next spring, a much larger group of Western Pennsylvania farmers marched on Philadelphia, hoping to kill the 114 native refugees who had gathered in that city for their own protection. British Army troops blocked their path, and the Paxton boys eventually turned around and went home, lucky to escape prosecution for their actions. And all the while, the native uprisings on the frontier continued. By the summer of 1764, after more than a year of brutal skirmishes against the colonists, Pontiac and Neolin's pan-native alliance began to lose steam. It was short of supplies. unable to capture any more forts or to lure France back to continue the fight against Britain, those natives were now looking for a way to make peace and perhaps resume trade with their unwelcome neighbors. The British and colonial governments were also eager for peace. And so in late 1764, as a gesture of reconciliation, the British finally assumed the role of gift givers, a role that the French practiced on this middle ground for decades before them. As part of their peace agreement with Pontiac's natives, the British colonies now drew up a boundary line designed to keep colonists and natives apart forever. The dividing line separating British North America in the east and Indian country west of it would run north to south along the ridge of the Appalachian Mountains. This new boundary line, known as the Proclamation Line, was a useful diplomatic gesture, and it did help to seal the peace negotiations with Pontiac's natives. But of course, it's just a line on a map. And in practice, it did absolutely nothing to stop the steady flow of colonial settlers across the Appalachians into Indian country in the decades after it was drawn onto the treaty map. Even when British troops occasionally burned the cabins of illegal American settlers beyond the line, it wasn't long before those settlers returned in greater numbers to rebuild. Nevertheless, the British government, at least, seemed to have learned its lesson about the importance of native diplomacy. Indeed, when the American colonies revolted against British authority a decade later, the British government was able to count on numerous native alliances against the Patriot cause because of the goodwill British officers had built up by this proclamation line and by assuming the role of gift givers on the frontier over the next 10 years. If the natives lost the balance of power after the French defeat in the 7 Years' War, what about the American colonists? Well, for the most part, the American colonists were delighted with the outcome of that global war. By 1763, Canada had been conquered, the French had been banished, the colonists were finally safe from the threat of any further French attacks. After years of inconclusive fighting, that war had finally produced a permanent advantage for the colonists of British America. Those colonists now had massive amounts of new territory, seemingly at their disposal. As one farmer's almanac put it in 1763, but now behold, the farmer may have land for nothing, land enough for himself and all his sons, be they ever so many. What's perhaps most important here is that the colonists took particular pride in the role they themselves had played in the fighting. Fighting alongside the regular British army had given colonists a sense of belonging, a sense of British identity. During a decade of fighting, they had stood shoulder to shoulder with the British in pursuit of a common goal, the defeat of the French. In Pennsylvania, Ben Franklin was thrilled by the outcome of the war, saying in 1763 that he felt a sense of triumph, not merely as I am a colonist, but as I am a Briton. In New York, the public paid for statues to be built of their new heroes, Prime Minister William Pitt and their new young king, George III, who had succeeded his grandfather, George II, when the latter died from a heart attack in 1760. Up in Salem, Massachusetts, a minister there told his diary that all signs now pointed to a bright future in which the American colonies would be the jewels in a British empire that would last forever. He wrote that here in America shall our indulgent mother country who has most generously rescued and protected us, be served and honored by our growing numbers, with all duty, love, and gratitude till time shall be no more. There was optimism in London too. The war with France had taught the British government to recognize the American colonies as important strategic partners. In fact, the British government had almost bankrupted itself to try to protect these precious American colonies from falling into the clutches of its oldest enemy. Before the Battle for America, the British Parliament had taken little interest in the American colonies. Arguably, British merchants had taken more interest in the expanding power of the colonies than had anyone in the British government. But now, in 1763, having poured a major investment of money and lives into North America for the purposes of winning a victory over France, now the British were not about to continue their pre-war policy of well-meaning neglect. So in the decade after the war's end, Parliament and the British Crown worked to strengthen their control over the administration of the American colonies, taking charge of governing responsibilities that they previously delegated to local legislatures in America. Specifically, over the decade that followed the end of the war in 1763, the British government would tighten the enforcement of the trade laws. It would station a permanent army presence in America, and it would levy new taxes to pay for this permanent garrison and to offset some of the costs of the recent war. Now, as I'm sure all of you know, those three shifts on this slide, those three shifts in imperial policy following the end of the French and Indian War, would shock the American colonists. They did not welcome these changes. They resented these changes, and they saw them as dangerous meddling by a parliament that had little understanding of American affairs. A parliament that seemed to be ungrateful for the key role that colonial militias had played in supporting the British Army in the battle for America. Tensions between the British government, which was trying to reassert its authority, and American colonists who claimed they didn't need such interference, escalated throughout the 1760s, to the point that by the early months of 1776, a vocal minority of colonists determined to defy the British Empire and set out on their own. Rebels tore down the statue of King George III in New York and used its lead to make cannonballs to fire at British redcoat troops. That, I think, is probably where I should stop. There was a lot to say in a short amount of time. I hope you kept up with me. Sorry we didn't have more time. On the top right of this final slide, you can see some of the readings that I think are particularly useful when studying the French and Indian War. Folks, you can take a camera pic of this slide if you'd like to. If you want to do more reading, these are 5 of the books you might want to start with in the top right. On the far left, you can see my book, which has nothing to do with any of this, but I'm never shy about mentioning it. So I'll turn things back to Anthony to get us going with some comments and questions.
Perfect. Well, the first one from Mike was about recommended books for this period. So that's
good.
All right, so let's get into it. We've got quite a few questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can. So I'm just going to start with John. John asked, which native allies did Braddock have with him at the Great Defeat?
Yeah, so I think I said he only had 8 native allies there. And John, I want to say to you that I don't have names for you here. And there'll probably be a bunch of questions that you're all curious about, which require the expertise of a military historian, someone really in the thick of different battles, commanders, regiments, and units. I want to say right up front that I'm not that guy. I am not a military historian. Many of my friends are military historians. I think the work they do is incredibly important. But if you notice from this talk, I tended to take a sort of higher altitude here and sort of consider the stakes of every point of this. So if you want names and dates, if you want to go deeper, John, the first book I always turn to is one of the books I had up on the screen a moment ago. I'll say its name out loud again. It's called The Crucible of War, The Crucible of War, and it's by the great University of Colorado historian, Fred Anderson. All your questions, military questions, can be answered by Fred Anderson's magisterial history of the American theater of the 7 Years' War. So I will always punt tough military history questions to Fred's book. You should check it out.
Perfect. I'm going to combine two questions from Mark and David. And I know you said you're not a military historian, but I just want to give you the opportunity if you want to talk about Major Robert Rogers and Sir William Johnson during this era.
Yeah, I don't know much about Rogers. I know a lot more about Sir William Johnson. I'll just tell people a couple of things, and this probably doesn't go far beyond the questioner's own knowledge here. But for folks who don't know those names, Sir William Johnson was a very important figure in the attempts by the British Empire to forge native alliances. And as you heard today, by the end of this story, by the end of the French and Indian War, forging native alliances has become, out of nowhere, a top priority for the British military and British diplomats, right? They almost lost the American colonies because the French had all the native allies and the British had far fewer. So to turn that around, the British government appoints a slate of, what do they call them? Superintendents for Indian affairs, I think they're called. You can think of them as diplomats charged with one mission only, which is cultivating positive, lasting, mutually profitable relations between the British Empire and different native groups. So they establish a superintendency in some of the southern colonies and another one in some of the northern colonies. And in the northern colonies, the superintendency is based at a giant mansion the British build just outside, not too far from Schenectady, if I'm remembering correctly. And the most important holder of that job is a guy called Sir William Johnson, who's an Irish-born career diplomat who's now sent over to upstate New York and told to build alliances with natives. As you can imagine, that's a very difficult task, given, decades of mistrust between local native groups in the British Empire. But Sir William Johnson proves remarkably adept at that. He does start giving gifts to local sachems, local leaders. He does respect hierarchies within local indigenous communities. He also, for better or worse, chooses to take as his unofficial wife a local Mohawk woman, and they begin a long and genuinely loving, actually, union, which produces 8 children, and she is often at his right hand during various diplomatic engagements he's involved in, and she sort of vouches for him. Her name is Molly Brant, and when Sir William dies right on the eve of the American Revolution in 1774, Molly Brant will sort of take over that intermediary role and try and keep an alliance going between the British Crown and the Iroquois Confederacy, which will become very important in the American Revolution. So that's a start.
Perfect. There is one question just on another reading, Braddock's Defeat. Do you recommend that for further reading?
I don't know much about that, so I have to go back. I would say I stand by all the books I put up on the screen here, but other works I think sometimes get too far into the weeds for my liking. And Fred's book, which I recommend because of its military content, also does all the things that I appreciate, which is broad political history, geopolitics, social history, women and the working class, and the lives of ordinary soldiers. One of Fred's other books called what is it? Let's check the slide. Called A People's Army, is a wonderful study of the actual soldiers on the ground, not their commanders and the decisions and the battles, but what the soldiers' lives were like. And anytime we can get into the lives of ordinary people who are not generals or presidents or prime ministers, I think we're doing what's called social history at that point. And Fred's very good at doing it all in different books. So I would stick with Fred Anderson for most of your questions on the French and Indian War.
Perfect. And we can probably get maybe 2 more questions in if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
So I want to pull Susan's because this is actually pretty interesting. I'm not sure if you'll know about this, but do you know what or where fort number 4 would be? She has a powdered horn passed down through her family that has a soldier's name and carvings, plus his horn made at number 4, October 10th, 1757. They've never figured out where that may have been, although they think it was Western Pennsylvania or Eastern Ohio.
Yeah, of course, I'm not the right person for that, but I can tell you that I'm friends with people who are the right people for that. So, Susan, if you want to contact me directly, send me an email. You can find my name online. I'm Richard Bell. I teach at the University of Maryland. You'll find my email address right away. If you send me an email, I will put you in touch with the chief curator and head historian at the Museum of the American Revolution, which I know is a different war than the one we're talking about. But he has identified all sorts of powder horns in his time, and many of his buddies do that for a living. So I can put you in touch with some professionals who can probably give you a much better answer than someone like me.
Perfect. And I'll just combine 2 more questions together in one, and then anyone that wants to continue this conversation, of course, we have the upcoming course with Professor Bell, one on the American Revolution, one on critical race theory in the 1619 Project. But Alvin and Tony, Alvin asked, how did this affect the French communities in Louisiana and Acadia? And Tony was wondering how the British funded all of these wars.
Yeah, 2 great questions here. Happy to try to answer them briefly in the time we have left. So I will say that I kept saying at the end, oh, the French were kicked out of North America, right? And in terms of geopolitics, that is true, right? The French government is not allowed to have a military or political presence in North America thereafter. Does that mean, however, that all French-speaking or French-ancestored people immediately teleport out of North America, or that Thanos clicks his fingers like in the Marvel movies and everyone disappears? No, there are plenty of French settlers, French traders, French merchants who now find themselves living under a British flag. And they have to decide whether that's something they're comfortable with or whether they want to evacuate themselves, because the French army won't necessarily help them do that. Or if they want to stay, how willing are they to assimilate into, English language or Protestant culture? France is predominantly a Catholic country, for instance. That does lead to a lot of French Catholics making dramatic changes to how they live their lives, and it leads to others really sticking out like a sore thumb and attracting a lot of intimidation and hostility from expanding British American settlers there. So that plays out differently in Louisiana and Acadia, but in general, I'd say that just because a treaty has said that France is no longer in America does not mean that those settlers have been taken care of, unfortunately. Now, that leads to all sorts of ripple effects. Was there a second half of the question, Anthony, that I've already... Oh, how do they pay for it? Yeah. Taxes is the short answer. The Britain in the second half of the 18th century is engaged in all sorts of very expensive wars. The 2 most expensive, of course, being the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, and then the American Revolution, which will follow it. We all know that to pay for the French and Indian War, Britain will levy some new taxes on American colonists. Think of the Stamp Act. Think of the Townshend duties, and that's true. But what you may not know is that Britain's also levying all sorts of taxes on its own subjects in Britain. there's plenty of British people in Britain. They're generally more affluent than the American colonists. So if you want to raise money quickly, you jack up taxes on British people, and they do. Those taxes don't go over well. No one likes having their taxes raised anywhere, anytime, for any reason. But those British subjects, of course, in Britain, don't have the advantages of distance that the American colonists do in trying to stage a anti-taxation insurgency, of course. And that's as good a setup as any, Anthony, to just remind people that the 4-part course that starts, I think, this time next week is going to pick up the story where we left it tonight. We left it in 1763. We're going to pick up in 1765 next week with the Stamp Act, and then we're going to move through the Townshend duties, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, the Coercive Acts, Lexington and Concord, and I think we're going to end, if we can manage it, with Tom Paine and Common Sense and the case for independence. So this is a preview, really, or a setup, or a prequel to what we're going to kick off with next week.
Exactly. Well, I want to thank you, Professor Bell, and I just again want to mention to everyone the links to the classes are in the chat. They will be sent out to you by email after the presentation. And again, I will ask Professor Bell if you want to talk about the critical race theory. Do you want to just say a few words about that?
Yeah, super quick. So this is a 2-part course, so in and out, right? 2 weeks. I'm going to give one lecture about the 1619 project, the New York Times project, what it is, what it's not, and why we should care about this stuff. You're going to get a historian's view on the accuracy and the significance of the 1619 project. And I'll tell you right now, I have some warm things to say and some very tough critiques of the 1619 project to offer at the same time, but from an historian's perspective. And then in the other week, we'll deal with critical race theory, which I think most people have heard of it by now, but how many of us actually know what it is? And I've read all this stuff to write this talk, so I will lay out clearly and slowly what critical race theory is. I will lay out the controversy and why it suddenly attracted so much attention. I will show you how those theorists perceive American history in the context of structural racism and white supremacy. And then I'll tell you some of the best practices that CRT scholars believe all of us can consider adopting if we want to make this country better for everyone and work for everyone. So if that appeals to you, to get an historian's take on CRT, an historian's take on the 1619 project, I hope you'll consider that one.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Professor Bell. I know that both classes are going to be absolutely fascinating. And again, if anyone has any questions or need any assistance, just email us at info@foreverscholars.com. And this recording will be made available to all registrants later this evening. So thank you all for joining, and thank you, Professor Bell. Fantastic as always.
Yeah.
All right. Have a good evening, everyone.